it wasn't always here, it wasn't always as present as it is now. And that you can track the path that created the situation we have. And they're outraged when they hear something like, you've got to work 135 hours a week to afford a place to live in Washington, D.C. They get it, and they get how wrong that is.
Welcome to the Harmony of Interest series, where we explore ideas that shape our world. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer for Empathy Media Lab that publishes content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we are a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Brian Carome, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Street Sense Media. Street Sense produces journalism, film, theater, photography, audio illustration, and more, all for the purpose of providing economic opportunity for and elevating the voices of people experiencing homelessness. The mission of Street Sense is to end homelessness in Washington, D.C. area by empowering people in need with skills, tools, and confidence to succeed. Brian joined the staff of Street Sense in November 2011. He has over 20 years of experience at nonprofit homeless service and child welfare agencies in the metro area. Brian, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Evan. We appreciate the opportunity to be here.
One of my first videos over a decade ago was at Occupy DC in Freedom Plaza with a Street Sense vendor named El Moro, and he read a poem that he wrote and published in Street Sense. And he was selling Street Sense papers, and I've been a fan ever since moving to DC in 2007. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
As am I, thank you.
So could you begin by talking about your background and how you got involved with homelessness issues?
Sure, it wasn't the plan. I decided between what I thought was college and grad school, to take a year off to do some service work. I got assigned to a project here in Washington, a drop-in center for homeless men and an emergency night shelter. These days we call it a hypothermia prevention program. And I just fell in love with the work. It was a different time. Homelessness was new. There was a lot of palpable outrage, mostly emanating from the faith community, but others as well. And Washington, D.C. was one of the centers of activism. And I'd been a history major in college. I appreciated the movement for change to try to address the situation, react to it, and end it. We clearly not succeeded in that, but I fell in love with the work and the folks it brings me in touch with.
So for those who've never heard of Street Sense, I did a little bit of an intro, but could you go a little deeper of what Street Sense is and what your day-to-day job is?
Sure. So we were founded in 2003 using the traditional street paper model. We didn't invent this model. It started in actually New York and in the mid 80s, and it's since spread all over the world. And at its most basic, a street newspaper writes about the local community, most often focusing in on extreme poverty and homelessness. And it gives men and women who are homeless and otherwise unemployable a chance to earn some money by vending or selling the newspaper. So today we've got about 130 folks who either are currently or have experienced homelessness, who sell our newspaper as independent contractors. We believe very strongly also, though, in bringing their voices forward into the community, into the debate, into the conversation. And so from the very beginning, the folks who sell the paper also have an opportunity to write for the paper. And I arrived, we were, I think, about 8 years old when I arrived in 2011, and we still had that very traditional model. And what we did a couple years later is we looked at what the newspaper was, where it was most successful and why. It was raising people's self-esteem. It was putting them in touch with people and community they otherwise would not have had contact with. And it was educating the public. And we began trying to replicate what the newspaper was across other platforms. The first of which, we partnered with two playwrights from George Washington University here in Washington and began a theater workshop that began doing performances later that year in 2015. And then followed by film. We've produced 6 films to date, all in some way around the story of homelessness. But most importantly, and we do photography, illustration, and graphic design, and podcasts. And in each of these areas, like the original newspaper, which is still very much our flagship project, men and women learn how to produce this media, whether it's writing or getting behind a camera and producing a film. or learning the skills of illustration, or photography, or audio engineering for podcasts. So in addition to telling stories, they're also picking up portable job skills as well.
Yeah, I absolutely love the model of skill building, of people finding their voice. There's dignity in actually getting paid for the work as well. And where is the newspaper printed around? Because we'll talk a little bit about how the pandemic has changed it, but where generally was it printed out?
So just so you know, we are back to print publication. We had a short pause in that during the pandemic, or in the early days of the pandemic, but we resumed last summer. The newspaper is put together, published, written here in our offices in Washington, D.C., and then it's electronically sent to a printer on the Eastern Shore about 2 hours away, and they deliver it, anywhere from 12 to 6 hours later, depending by how much we miss our deadlines. And that's been the process since we began in 2003.
And you can find Street Sense vendors all around DC. They're wearing the Street Sense vest, and they're selling it on the corner. And I think everyone should absolutely read this paper and engage more with the people and who are telling these stories. So could you talk about what it means to criminalize homelessness?
Sure, and we see this all across the country. Folks are homeless for a lot of complicated reasons, but it can usually be boiled down to the gap between wages and the cost of housing, or the level of support we provide for persons with permanent disabilities, physical and mental health related. Some communities are doing their best to try to do creative, affordable housing. Others are trying to sort of legalize it away, make it go away by making it illegal to loiter or sit in the same place, making it illegal to sleep outside, making panhandling illegal, breaking up encampments, which our current mayor has been very fond of doing here in DC. What I know about folks who are living outside is they have, by and large, tried the shelters and found them uninhabitable, unsafe, unsanitary, and not good for them and for their health. So the folks who are living in the encampments are doing the best they can to create community, to protect each other, and to protect each other from the elements, and to just get by. And as is happening in many, many cities, it's also happening here in DC. A lot of those encampments have just been torn down, and people's tents have been thrown away, and people just told to move on.
And I think it's such an indication of the society that we live in on how we treat the least among us with the least amount of means. And that's where I'm so interested in the policy side of things and what the federal government can do. And living in Washington, DC, there's trillions of dollars of revenue raised. There's even more trillions through the Federal Reserve that is spent. And there's been some recent media about President Biden's efforts to fund more housing initiatives through the Housing and Urban Development Agency led by Marcia Fudge. And Washington Post even did a interview with Wall Street banker turned Federal Reserve President Jerome Powell, going on record that we need to reduce homelessness. And he refers to a homeless encampment outside of the Federal Reserve, which was involved with $7 trillion of outlays beginning in September 2019, even before COVID started, to prop up Wall Street banks. So I just want to ask a little bit about what are some of the key policies that we should be pushing to help end homelessness, and what are your thoughts about some of Biden's developments?
Sure. So, when I began doing this work, that the approach was essentially could be described or characterized as housing last. You had to save up X amount of dollars. If you were struggling with addiction, you had to be sober for 6 months or more. If you were suffering from mental illness, you had to be engaged successfully in a treatment plan before housing would even be discussed or put up as an opportunity. The very best approach that governments across the country, especially at the local level, have taken is called Housing First. It essentially targets those who are furthest away, most in need, most vulnerable, and it provides them with housing and wraparound services, but most easily seen in a case manager, someone who will check in on them, help them link to other services. And what has been discovered, Evan, is that these programs, while they are expensive, actually save much more money than they cost. Because the police aren't responding to someone who's urinating in public, or someone isn't having to spend an overnight in jail. And most importantly, folks are engaging in the healthcare that they need, not just cycling through emergency rooms. They're getting better in a way that they couldn't when they were living on the streets. And taxpayers are benefiting from these programs. I mean, at this point, it's just economic insanity if we're not investing in these housing first programs.
And I'm also a big fan of this concept of the economic bill of rights, that everyone's guaranteed a house. And at the same time, if the private market doesn't deliver jobs, then people can get a job and be able to support themselves and their families. So
I mean, in this city, you've got to be working essentially, if you're a minimum wage worker, 3 full-time jobs, which is pretty much impossible, to be able to afford housing for you and your family. And that gap, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, between the cost of housing and wages, we have to do something about that, because it's just plain wrong in a nation as wealthy as ours. But as I was just speaking about with the housing first model, it doesn't make economic sense. Homelessness is far too costly. The solution is much less expensive.
So one of the headlines from Street Sense recently is, quote, "As its more comprehensive report on homelessness lags years behind, critics question HUD's data." So could you talk a little bit about what is the data? How many homeless people are in Washington, D.C., and if you want to use also national numbers? And how can we do a better job to at least begin to even understand the scope of the problem?
Sure. So the official count would suggest that there are between 7,000 and 8,000 people who are homeless in DC, and it's a number that has, stayed pretty stagnant for many years now. That number is derived via what is called a point-in-time survey. If your community wants to compete for scarce federal housing dollars and homeless assistance dollars, you have to conduct a point-in-time survey, which is essentially a one-day count of the number of people who are homeless. And what advocates like myself have said forever, these counts have been required for far more than 20 years now, is that they're grossly inaccurate. They miss far too many people. They also don't take into account, folks who are couch surfing, for instance. They don't have their name on a lease. An argument can put them out, as opposed to a judge evicting them. So the estimates, probably are more in the 20 to 30,000 between folks who are genuinely homeless but weren't counted, and those folks who don't have their name in a lease and are living very unstably.
And that's 20,000 in a city of about 650 to 750,000.
Sure. For too many years, DC's per capita has had the highest rate of homelessness in the country. And then you look at cities like Los Angeles or New York. I mean, I think the last count in Los Angeles was close to 70,000 in LA County. And again, you've got to presume that's an undercount. I mean, one year I think they counted 35 unaccompanied youth that were homeless, and we know that that number's in the hundreds every night here in the city. Again, a lot of them are couch surfing or just not being seen, making sure that they're not seen and not drawing attention to themselves.
So talking about the dignity of just human beings on the street, there's so many people who see homelessness and they don't want to confront it. They don't want to see it. Makes them feel uncomfortable, but there's a human being there. What do you tell people to try to humanize homelessness?
The first thing I do is I ask them to imagine their extended family, and none of us have to dive too deep into extended family to find someone who's experienced domestic violence or chronic mental illness or substance abuse and alcoholism or drug abuse. All of us, every American family, experiences those issues, either in the household of origin or maybe with a cousin or an uncle or an aunt. Those are some of the gateways, beyond the economics. Those are some of the gateways into homelessness. and to try to help us understand that these are people. They were born into families. They had dreams and hopes. They did their best to get an education, and their life ran off the rails. And what we have the privilege here of doing in homelessness is being in relationship with people. And what we find again and again and again is the commonality and the common ground we share. We can see the turning points in each of our lives towards success or towards homelessness, or economic ruin. And we should understand that it is an issue that affects all of us in one way or another. So what I ask people to do is have conversation. Don't treat a person who's homeless as invisible. The folks that we work with understand the transformation, powerful opportunities that are in storytelling. And they enjoy telling their story. They know that around their story, they can build relationship and build community. And so anytime someone sees one of our folks out selling a newspaper, ask them, how did you end up here? Tell me your story. And our folks are proud to tell those stories.
So how can people support Street Sense Media?
Overwhelmingly, our support comes from individual donors. First off, I'd ask folks to buy our newspaper, to read the newspaper, to learn about the issue and learn about the people it affects. And if they're moved by what they read, if they believe the model, we would appreciate people's financial support. You can go to our website, streetsensemedia.org, and click on the donate button and send your funds our way, and we put them to work. We're a very lean organization, very small administrative staff, and overwhelmingly about 80 cents of every dollar, more than 80 cents of every dollar goes into direct services to the men and women we serve.
So in closing, where do you see opportunity and hope?
As I said, the housing model is spreading a little too slowly, but it is spreading, that idea that there is a solution. I think we are understanding that there's been a massive failure in providing mental health services in this country. It's not something we talked about much today, but we've got to do better than that. And I think people are beginning to understand that. People are beginning to understand the cost of homelessness. And in our case, more and more people are reading our paper every day and learning more about the issue and about the people it affects. I also have hope. We meet with a lot of college students and high school students every year, whether it's at an informational session or a forum or one of our theater or film performances. And these are folks who seem to genuinely care about the issue. They're surprised to learn it wasn't always here. It wasn't always as present as it is now. And that you can track the path that created the situation we have. And they're outraged when they hear something like, you've got to work 135 hours a week to afford a place to live in Washington, D.C. They get it, and they get how wrong that is. So my hope is that we can rekindle that sense of outrage, and do what's wise and invest in solutions.
Brian, Carome, thank you so much for your time and all the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Evan. I appreciate the conversation.